during the late 30s, World War II years, as the cannery expanded operations and more people came in, the people noticed a trend in that people, when they weren't working and they're day off from the cannery, went out to go hunting, many of them did not come back. And a few of their bodies, though, washed up from the hills down in runoff into the lagoon in the port to get to Portlock. And they had been savaged and not eaten. They knew what it looked like if somebody had been eaten by a bear, and it was not a bear. My name is Jeff Davis. I was born in Vancouver, Washington, and I have a varied career, a lot of it out in the wild. I have a bachelor's in anthropology, a master's in archaeology. I also spent 32 years in and out of the U.S. military. I did a lot of archaeology work for the U.S. Forest Service throughout the Pacific Northwest, mostly in the Cascade Mountains, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the Mount Hood National Forest, the Umatilla National Forest, and I also worked on the Boise National Forest for a while. Now, getting into, brought me into cryptozoology and Bigfoot in particular, is my archaeology work, the fact that I did work throughout the Cascades. Also, anthropology itself is the study of human cultures other than our own. And so I had to, as part of my job, I had to read ethnographies. An ethnography is an account, is a record where you go from one culture to the next and you just say, simply tell us your story, especially about religion, cultural practices, and so on. And there is a rich tradition amongst Native peoples throughout the Pacific Northwest about the creature that we call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And so that got me interested. When I first started working for the Forest Service and was out in the woods, there was not a open conspiracy where the administrator said, don't tell anyone that you saw a Bigfoot. But there was an undercurrent of negativity. We were there to do a job. I was there to do archaeology work, to look for the remains of historic buildings, structures, and so on, as well as Native American sites in the woods. And there was this undercurrent of, well, if you're wasting all your time looking for Bigfoot, you must not want a job with us. And so people who did come in and say they had seen strange things or heard strange things were kind of ridiculed. I remember there was one case where we had if I said civilian, we had somebody who was not a Forest Service employee who was a Bigfoot enthusiast and Bigfoot hunter and investigator. And he believed that the whole cave networks throughout the Southern Cascades had habitat that Bigfoot, especially in winter, was camping out there to avoid the cold. And he would go into these caves, search them. He even wove fiber mats, large ones, because they were Bigfoot and they were big, and he put them in the caves. And on one occasion, and I'm fuzzy now on the facts, but there were caves and then there were narrow passages opening to larger caves, and he thought it was too small, the passage, for Bigfoot to get into, so he brought some explosives to open up the caves. And he did it without a permit. And so there was a hue and an outcry because that cave network also had rare and endangered animal species living in it. And so there was an investigation, and it turned out one of his family members was an administrator at my Forest Service unit. And so there was kind of a stigma on her about her crazy relatives. So from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, if somebody now comes forward and says, I had a Bigfoot experience, but I never talked about it, that's one of the reasons why not. Every now and then, mostly in the summer, late spring through fall, everybody had their jobs and they were out there in the woods doing their jobs. But in the wintertime, I was employed year round for several years doing office work, write-ups, and things like that. And so at lunchtime, oftentimes small groups of us would gather. We had a little break room, and every now and then people would talk about weird stories. And so every now and then somebody would talk about more along the lines of a third person. Well, I was talking to my cousin Zeke, and he had this experience. But if you read between the lines, no, it was probably them, but they didn't want to be identified as having these experiences. And so people did. This has to be separated from the fact that, again, you usually only find stuff when you're looking for it. Otherwise, our paradigm keeps us with blinders on. So that if you're out there as a civil engineer figuring out where the road's going to go, you're not paying attention to anything besides your little gizmos. But I remember several times, the winter's over with, it's spring, the snow is melting, it's time to go out into the field, and how strange it was driving in my Forest Service truck. The road ends, I get out, and then to get to the area I was doing archaeology work, it would be sometimes land navigation with a compass and map for an hour to get to the job site. And it was always very jarring because stuff's going on around you, peripheral vision, trees, branches, small animals in particular that are curious about us humans because they've never seen us before getting close. And who knows what I did not perceive? Who knows, some of these knocking noises in the woods may well have actually been something like a Bigfoot or larger creature that was just as surprised to see me as I would have been to see them, but I didn't perceive them. And it's not because the possibility is not there. It's more along the lines of I was just not prepared to see them. One of the things required for my job, for any archaeologist that are working for the Forest Service, is consultation with Native American tribes and groups. And in the case of my work, especially for the Gifford Pinchot, I had a boss who I admire tremendously, probably the best field archaeologist I ever met. And he was a genuine caring individual and a mentor to me. And so he took the lead on Native American contact because, of course, he was the district archaeologist. But oftentimes I was allowed to take part as his assistant in some of these consultations and meetings. And of course, more important than the actual consultation, sitting down with tribal elders specifically about a project was just the social end, getting to meet them as people and letting them know we were people too. We were not just some government agents trying to do something that they probably wouldn't like. And so we sat down many times. Again, I don't want to steal anybody's thunder. And so it was being an observer instead of actually being the principal. It was really valuable to me to see interactions between white U.S. government officials and non-U.S. government Native officials. And some of these consultations were about archaeological sites and so on. And so we archaeologists would be puzzling over what's this pile of rocks? Why was this pile of rocks here? And then we'd show pictures to our native visitors, and they'd chuckle, look at each other, and say, "Oh yeah, those pile of rocks there, that was just a refrigerator. You go ahead and dig down into the rocks and scoop out a hole and put meat in there and just cover it over and it'd be insulated." And look at us like, "How come you didn't know that?" And so it's a little bit humbling and educational. And this brings to Native American traditions again about Bigfoot. The World War II historically, as a series of events where you get the nationalization of everybody in the United States, and industrialization ended a lot of traditional lifestyles. Some villages along the coast and in the interior before World War II, people were kind of living their lifestyle with very little impact. But after World War II, industry got there, couldn't stop it. And so a lot of these spoken traditions started going away. So the best ethnographies are prior to World War II. And patterns developed where there were people living off of Vancouver, British Columbia, whose stories about these people of the forest had a lot of similarities to stories from the Spokane River Valley. And so there's a lot of distance. If you have story just repeated that entire distance, it's a long way to travel for details to come in that are so similar. Some of these details that are shared is that a lot of cultural elements talk about actually two kinds or two subsets of these wild people of the forest. The one the stories we're most familiar with being 6, 7, 8 feet tall, weighing 1,000 pounds, and being wanting to just be left alone, as opposed to a lot of cultures talk about smaller hairy people, and they were malevolent. They were the ones who were wandering the woods, in some cases performing magic. For instance, many of the peoples believe that they carried sticks, magic sticks, and they would be hitting trees with the sticks and knocking them over. In some cases, they would do it to actually hurt humans. If they were humans were wandering in their area, they want to get rid of them. These smaller beings would knock the trees over on people and kill them or scare them away. And they also had the ability to make sounds like birds, other things in people's voices, and hypnotize people. In particular, children would wake up in the middle of the night hearing bird song, and then they would hear voices telling them to come outside and play. And most of the time that was blamed on these smaller big feet. And other things that people have talked about is what some people call eye flash, where if you're out and going backward in time, if you got a torch or a lantern and you hold it up and shine it, and then you see the light reflecting off the eyes, and it's not the same as the color of, say, a rabbit. Usually you get a red light flashing back. It's very different nature and character. People talk about that. Again, up and down the Northwest, the smell, and many other smaller details. Even though I was based in the Pacific Northwest, again, the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, the Mount Hood National Forest, I did work east of the Cascades. I worked a season for the Umatilla National Forest, and I worked for the Boise National Forest on what was called fire recovery. A couple decades ago, there was a massive fire that burned thousands of acres, and so they needed archaeologists to come in and assess the damage. So I did two off seasons for them too. And so, of course, anthropologists, archaeologists get together and gossip, because usually in a Forest Service district, there's only one archaeologist, and there may be six engineers, 5 wildlife biologists, but you don't have anybody to share stories about. And here's one of the things. I had at university, I had an anthropology professor, and I came back as kind of a graduate student and was talking to him about things. And I asked him about odd things, what some people consider magic amongst native peoples. And he said, yeah, all of us have this kind of stuff happen. Where he had related a case in the American Southwest where there was a Native American shaman healer, and my anthropologist professor was studying them, and he interrupted the ceremony, and the next night he woke up in the middle of the night and saw a man with glowing white eyes standing outside of his window looking at him. And he went outside, and there were no marks on the ground. And he said, stuff like this happens, but you think that we're going to go ahead and write this up in papers and tell people? No, because we'll never get another grant and everybody will make fun of us. So that's why anthropology-wise, sometimes it's closed, where we talk amongst ourselves and say, but don't tell anybody. I don't have any specific cases other than this was related to me, that there was a cave where people had been living for off and on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They would come back in hunting parties and stay there for a couple of weeks and then go. and they were doing some archaeology in this cave, and I believe it was an owl flew into the cave in daytime and was there living in the cave, just kind of watching them, and they were watching the owl. And then when they finished the excavations and started filling in the holes, the owl flew out and left, and it never came back. Other cases, again, where you just get this feeling, as I was saying, you have to separate out what's just this odd feeling because I haven't been to the woods before, or I haven't been there for months and months, as opposed to I'm used to what's normal, what's natural. All of a sudden the birds stop singing, and I'm looking around to see what new has been added, what threatening thing is here. And so oftentimes those are the cases where we get anthropologists where they're talking and say, I've been working in the woods for years and I had this happen, or I did think out of the corner of my eye I saw something. But it's when we do consultation with our local Native American community, again, to them, it's part of the everyday world to them. And so then they kind of like nudge you and nudge each other and say, oh, so you finally saw this, or you finally saw that. When I was studying in my undergrad days, and I went to Portland State University, and my boss got funding for me to attend the Washington State Anthropological Conference. I think it was NWAC at the time. And we got there, and there are symposiums where some usually a PhD or professor will say, I will be the chair and organize and even get people to submit papers on a subject. For instance, this will sound long, trans-Pacific contact with North America. That is, people's intentionally or accidentally crossing the Pacific from Asia and ending up on the West Coast of North America, United States, Japanese fisher folk and things like that. So they will organize these symposium, and every year, and this is in the 1980s, there was a symposium on what some people call Bigfoot, and it was organized by Professor Grover Krantz, Washington State University. And again, my boss was so open to just about everything, and sure, why not? And yet, I said, so Bigfoot symposium, and I was kind of interested in going. And he said, I don't know if you really want to go to that because it's put on by Grover Krantz, but, which to me meant Grover Krantz was well respected as an archaeologist and anthropologist, but maybe he was just a little bit off as far as his belief in the possibility. And so this is part of or an example of, we're going to at least pretend to be open-minded about the possibility, but are we actually going to go to a symposium where somebody tries to present us with facts when we've already made up my mind it's not possible? And so I think I did attend one session, among other things, because one of the professors from my alumni, Portland State University, presented there as an anthropologist. See, this is the whole thing, is people have to be, even if they don't believe it, or they're halfway certain it's not possible, what about that 5% chance it is possible? And so I think his name was Suttles, Dr. Suttles, presented. And he added to a paper, written paper that went into a book called The Scientist Looks at Sasquatch. Or is it Scientist Looks at Bigfoot? And it was an anthropological work, but he was one of these people who went through these ethnographies from the Spokane River Valley all the way to British Columbia and southern Alaska, and treated it as a research question. See, I guess to bridge the gap, really what I hope will happen is academics and enthusiasts will be able to agree, even if at the very beginning we don't quite agree, let's at least treat it seriously. Let's not immediately start ridiculing it. If you're going to, don't pretend you have an open mind, have an open mind. And so Grover Krantz spent many, many years promoting this as an interest and writing books on the subject, scientific books. And I think he pays sort of a price in that the delay it took him to get full professorship at Wazoo. But nobody disputed he was a great archaeologist. Nobody disputed he was a great researcher. He was just a little odd. And so we need people who actually have letters after their names or before their names to actually say, I have a hard time believing it, but let's treat this seriously. If we have somebody who wants to treat this with an open mind, try and look at it scientifically. All right, so we've got examples of Bigfoot sightings all the way from Spokane to Prince Rupert Island. What are the commonalities in all of these sightings? Is it the glow-in-the-dark eyes? Is it the fur, the smell, the size, the behavior? And look for these commonalities. And then look at the ethnographies. Are there examples of all this kind of stuff, right? And then go to modern cryptozoologists, amateur or professional, and see, do they kind of criteria match? I mean, that's scientific, isn't it? And so Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who recently passed, he was another one of these people who said, let's treat it seriously. Even if the end result of scientific research says probably not, or many of these sightings may be kind of hysterical, or, but let's the expression winnow the chaff. Let's separate out really good reports, really good first-person identifications, and just look at them. I mean, it sounds like I'm saying it's so simple, but somehow it's a little bit harder to actually do it. Scientific method is a cyclical process. It's not do these steps and you're done. Scientific method is you come up with a hypothesis, you come up with a theory that's based off of research that you've already done. And then you look at this theory and then you say, let's test it. Let us design a series of experiments to test it. And then you test the theory. And then when you test the theory, you don't just look for evidence that supports your claim or your theory. You have to, if you're going to be honest, you've got to also record data that says, no, your original theory is not right. And then what you do is you go back and you readjust the theory. You say, okay, these elements of the original theory didn't work. Let's reformat the theory. It's okay to say I can't say I was wrong, but I was not quite right. Now I am more right. And then you go back into the cycle, you jump back in and test it as a continuous process. And it's so unfortunate, especially to our world exists in a moneyed environment where if you don't have money, we can't hunt or gather for food anymore. Most of us can't. And so you need money to buy food while you're doing other things. So it is unfortunate that people pay the price sometimes for independent academic thought. And so, as I was saying, there's this whole reluctance to talk about this stuff openly because they're afraid it's going to affect their income. And it's not all selfish. People have families, they have kids, they have wives, they have parents that are part of their greater circle they have to take care of. So I cannot fault anybody for being a little bit afraid of coming out openly saying, oh my God, I saw Bigfoot. There's a really common expression. It's everybody's a skeptic until it happens to them, or nobody believes it again until it happens to them. And I don't just do cryptozoology, the search for Bigfoot and other supposedly extinct critters. I guess I would in times bill myself as a paranormalist. And by paranormal, what I mean is paranormal is I witness or experience a phenomenon that's not normal. It's as simple as that. 300 and some years ago, electricity was paranormal. It was a phenomenon that people observed, but couldn't quite explain, could they? And then Benjamin Franklin and the kites and Edison and Tesla and all of that. So, and it's okay to be a skeptic because if you're overly credulous, then you're taken in. Either mentally, people become dependents, codependents, because they believe things too easily, and they fall prey to things like religious or social cults. So I have noticed, because I've been doing this for a while, there is the three major subdivisions of paranormal that I've observed is Bigfoot, and I always want to use the word cryptozoology, because there are many supposedly extinct animals that people see. Every year you can go online and just do a Google search, cryptozoology, extinct animals people have rediscovered. And every year, oftentimes there's a list you can find on various websites. But the other is ghosts, and the third is UFOs, or space phenomena that, again, is just not explained. And it was interesting to me up until recently how there really was a dividing line between the three subfields, subdisciplines, where people who believed in UFOs some of them would be really not just skeptical, but antagonistic to ghost hunters because they were religious fanatics and overly credulous, and yet then a bunch of big hunters would go after the ufologists because they're just kind of wacko space monkeys and so on. And I saw that, and but just in the last couple of years, particularly in cryptozoology, like ghost people talking to cryptozoologists, that there's a shading, the barriers breaking down somewhat, and they're finding things like maybe there are some commonalities. Let's look at some of these ethnographic stories about the wild people of the forest. Are they myth or perhaps supernatural beings? For instance, in ancient societies, there's a belief that all things, rocks, stones, trees, have souls, and that perhaps Bigfoot is a spiritual being on that realm. And this is shading over too, where people involved in cryptozoology, Bigfoot hunting, are thinking maybe Bigfoot is an extra-dimensional being, and they're talking about physics and the possibility that there are locations on the Earth, extramagnetic pole strength, things like that engender this kind of weakness between dimensions, and so that may be why Bigfoot is different. It's not a terrestrial animal to some people, and it may be an extra-dimensional being. And sure, why not? Why not make up a list of all the possible theories, and then look at them scientifically? Don't just dismiss them as being wacko crackpot stuff. Well, let's look at it. Is it possible by physics? Is it possible by the cryptozoology trends of animals supposedly being extinct but not? And just be open to it. In approaching the question about does Bigfoot exist, it's almost the same for me as do ghosts exist? And another saying is Occam's razor, which it was originally in Latin, but various English translations basically suggest that in a situation where you have a question with multiple possible answers, you're not sure which answer is correct, the simplest answer is most likely the correct answer. And so as far as ghosts, virtually every culture on Earth has a belief that when we die, something happens, and there's a split off between the body and the spiritual nature of a person, ghost. And so in my thinking about Occam's razor is, you got this complicated question, every culture believes in it, maybe there's something to it. Similarly, many cultures across the world believe that out there in the dark, there is something, Bigfoot, and these stories have many, many similarities, even with these cultural groups that are hundreds, if not thousands of miles apart, that have never contacted each other before. So the suggestion is, via Occam's razor, and this is prior to the scientific experiments, there's got to be something to it. And so that's kind of how I approach this. And in terms of here, where I'm based out of Vancouver, Washington, anthropological journals, and there's a couple historic accounts, one of which talks about how the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver hired many Native people and Hawaiians to work for them as employees. They were in place from about 1824 to about 1855. And according to one of the stories written down by an American explorer, one of the Hudson's Bay Company employees had married a Native woman at Fort Vancouver, and a Bigfoot came down out of the woods and kidnapped her and was carrying her off, like on his shoulder or under his arm. And she was screaming, so everybody was chasing the Bigfoot carrying the woman, and then he dropped her. So this is a historic account, isn't it? And there must be something to it. So in looking particularly at my area, I believe that prior to World War II, there may well have been Bigfoot, the habitat, safe habitat for them, could have existed in the Cascade Mountains around Washington and Oregon. But World War II, industrialization, massive fires and wood cutting for World War II and prior to World War II, and now the local population of people who go hiking and hunting in the woods in season. When I was doing archaeology work, there would be areas I went into where theoretically nobody had been there for centuries, and yet I would find candy wrappers every now and then because hunters and other people who were curious and explorers. So if Bigfoot is a solitary critter, and there's a lot of anecdotal suggestions that they live far apart, sort of like pandas, then habitat has shrunk here in my local area, which doesn't mean that further north into places like southern British Columbia, central British Columbia, and Alaska, Bigfoot doesn't exist, or does exist. We have to find out. When I was talking about Bigfoot maybe being independently evolving here, it would then spread outward. And so if you really want to think about the total concentration, number of reports from North and South America, and because this is the homeland, that there are going to be smaller and smaller populations the further out you go. Fewer and fewer sightings, which doesn't mean that they're not out there. There are just fewer of them because this is the homeland. Just like monkeys in Africa and what happened to them in the rest of the world. Like Madagascar broke off from Africa about the Oligocene, which is getting back to what I was talking about lemurs. But this here's the other thing. This they did a reconstruction of this lemur, and proportionately, as far as we're used to seeing things, leg length and arm length, this thing has massively long arms and very small legs. This might be a criteria to look at Bigfoot sightings. If we had something like a Bigfoot sighting form that was detailed enough to get people to write down descriptions proportionately. How long were the arms versus how long were the legs? Was it hairy? Did it smell? What was the shape of his nose? What color were his eyes? If you were unlucky enough to get that close to it, what were the color of its eyes? I talked to people who were face-to-face, a couple people, and they have an atypical description to me, is a squash flat nose, and human-looking eyes. For decades, for those people who have been cryptozoologists who have been speculating on Bigfoot, of course, the question is, where did Bigfoot begin? Where did somehow this critter get really, really big and tall? And my hair is not standing upright, so I can't say, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. No. That's a serious question. Most anthropologists who are willing to discuss the nature of Bigfoot suggest that Bigfoot is what's known as a Gigantopithecus from Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. There have been a handful of fossilized skull bones, jaw bones, skull fragments and jaw fragments found from a giant, quote, ape-like creature that had just been named Gigantopithecus, which would have stood 7 to 8 foot tall, weighed 400 to 700 pounds, depending on who you talk to in the estimates. And that the theory is that Gigantopithecus, and this is over 1 million years old, these fossilized bits, that they were all up and down Asia, and that in the days of the land bridge, in between ice ages, that they made the crossing to North America and came down in North America, and that's how they got here. And nobody else has suggested this, but I guess I am here. In that, what if it's different? What if Bigfoot developed here in North America or South America on its own, descendant from New World apes? And we know the New World apes came from Africa about 30 million years ago. 30 million years is a long time for a species to evolve, to get bigger, to get smaller, to grow longer tails, to get shorter tails. So what if, I state again, Bigfoot developed here in North America? This is the homeland, in North America or Central America, and it spread out from there into all of North America. Looking at the total number of sightings and reports of something like Bigfoot, for instance, in Siberia. This one anthropological book, The Scientist Looks at Sasquatch, that's the title. They have a Russian researcher who talks about Bigfoot sightings in Siberia, opposite Alaska to Asia. And there are sightings in Tibet, right? The Yeti. And so what if Bigfoot did expand outward to Asia from North America, but because this is the homeland, there are more of them, which means more sightings. And the further you stretch across Asia into Europe, not very many sightings. So, and that may be because they just didn't make it that far to begin with. I was really privileged a couple years ago when COVID, just as COVID was shutting down the world. I was approached by a friend of mine. His name is Brian Niffel, and he's a television producer, writer, director, producer. And I had worked with Brian several episodes of a television show called The Dead Files, which is a ghost hunter TV show. And so I'm more than happy to go on shows like that because I came on board as a historian. They were in the Pacific Northwest. Odd and unusual things happened. Usually it's a murder. And so do some research, Jeff, and come on and talk about it. And so Brian set up his own production company, and one of his first efforts was a show called Alaskan Killer Bigfoot. And he said, "You'll be perfect for this, Jeff. It's a Bigfoot." And he wanted me to come on, again, as I am, as a researcher, historian, and anthropologist. And so I did. I got out my Bigfoot references, the ethnographies I had available, and did some more searching and went through historic records, because the show, Alaskan Killer Bigfoot, was filmed in the remains of a town some people call Port Chatham, other people call Portlock in Alaska, which is at the tip of the Kenai Peninsula. And it's hard to tell where to begin on this, because Native Americans had been living on this part of the peninsula, this little point, off and on for centuries. There would be an occupation for decades to 100 or 200 years, and then all of a sudden they would abandon the site, and soils would accumulate, and time passes, and then people come back. Multiple occupations in prehistoric times. And going into the late 1700s, early 1800s, various explorers stopped there on the site. One of them was a Spanish explorer's name was Bazan. Another one was Captain Nathaniel Portlock, who was a colonial American serving in the British Navy. And so this is during the time of the American Revolution. And so he visited there too, and they kept logs. And in those days, they published their logs. That's how, in some cases, they funded the next voyage, is by publishing logs, and people bought the books, and that funded the next expedition. So there's a rich history of historic articles, but also the anthropologists had come through too over the decades from surrounding communities. They didn't speak to anybody directly in Portlock. I've got to be clear about that. But we have historic newspaper articles and living people who shared stories about what happened. So about 1900 or so, a fishing fleet cannery operation opened in Portlock, and they were very, very successful. Within a couple of years, they had about 100 seasonal employees. They had their own school, their own church. They had a post office, which was a tremendous social and business boost to any community out in the middle of nowhere. But again, during the late 30s, World War II years, as the cannery expanded operations and more people came in, the people noticed a trend in that people, when they weren't working, they're day off from the cannery, went out to go hunting. Many of them did not come back, and a few of their bodies, though, washed up from the hills down in runoff into the lagoon in the port to get to Portlock, and they had been savaged and not eaten. They knew what it looked like if somebody had been eaten by a bear, and it was not a bear. And so virtually the late 50s, virtually overnight, there had been rocks rolling down the ravine onto buildings and cries in the night. And so virtually overnight, the entire village was abandoned. The postmaster stuck around for a little while because he needed permission to shut down the post office. And so the tribal corporation still owns the land. And so it was in the early 2020s, they wanted to see whether or not they could make a living at it again, whether or not they could reestablish a cannery operation and fishing fleet and move their families there. And so that was the opening premise for this. And I talked to, they brought a guy named Kyle, who was a bear guard. He's an outfitter. And he said that when he came on board, they told him, "Oh, this is our expedition. You're going to follow along and make sure no bears kill anybody." And they're just looking to see establish the operations. But shortly after arriving, strange things happened, because Nantinak, that is their wild person of the forest, apparently was still there. And so almost from day one, bizarre stuff started happening to them. And so it just kind of follows. And there is this mix always in the background. They were there with a purpose. I met and spoke for several hours to Keith, who is kind of the expedition leader. He was the tribal leader. And that was always on his mind, is because he had kids and he wanted to establish a better life for his family. But weird stuff happened. And so they brought in various experts in the paranormal, and this is not just Bigfoot hunters. It's also spiritualists and ghost hunter types, because they were not sure what is Nantinak. Based on the stories of the local people, he was more than just a terrestrial, just an earthly critter, something more. I have to be very clear to people, because there's a misconception that I physically went into Portlock. I did not. In part, that's because it's not easy to get to. And I've heard criticism. It's only 5 miles away, air miles. Yeah, but it's 2.5 miles up a mountain, and it's 2.5 miles down a mountain. Really, the only way to get to Portlock is by boat. And the only transport they had was because they were carrying cargo most of the time, was a very small, very slow boat. Could have gone in by helicopter, but they didn't have that much money. It's an expensive proposition, especially this was in the summer when people are earning a living and the helicopters are charging a lot of money to tourists to take them to other locations. So I never made it to Portlock, I came and brought my research, and I actually dropped off my research with Keith. I met them in Homer, and so we weren't sure when they were coming in. So I was kind of like, I don't want to say camped out, but I was positioned there for hours, waiting for them to come in and just getting comfortable. And so I was storing my stuff. There was somebody loaned me a camper, and so I met them there, and we had our discussions. And I had two separate visits with them, and through the magic of Hollywood, though, I'm in 7 episodes. Because I was usually, we're all used to I don't want to say reality TV, non-scripted television. You get 1 or 2 people who come in. There's a purpose for this episode. So on 2 separate occasions, I had historic discussions with Keith and Ash Naderhoff, and then simply with Ash because Keith was busy doing other things, and so. I appeared 5 more times as a flashback because I had that early visit with them, and in the evenings, what do you do when you're camping or hunting and it's dark and you're not out there? You talk around the campfire. And so indeed, I show up 5 times, and if you watch the show, you'll see me usually saying, "Don't go in the woods at night," or something like that. It was a lot of fun. It was good work. I was helping real people. After the show aired, because of circumstance, it was not renewed. But to talk about how popular it was and still is, they had a fan book or fan page on Facebook that had 26,000 followers on it. And so I was working with the guys and the local, well, actually international podcaster network. And so I was kind of a volunteer coordinator, setting up podcasts to explain the show and to get interest in it across the world. There's a new theory that somebody talked to me about that I started investigating, that it's an open thing. It's getting to the scientific method. This is a working theory first. It's not even something that's been tested. So if anybody who watches this gets interested and enthused, I hope you do, and I hope you work on it too. And hopefully in the coming days, months, and years, it expands out and gets tested by people and amended and changed as more facts come about. In 2025, I was at a cryptozoology conference in the UK because somebody believed that they actually saw and found evidence of Bigfoot in the UK. Very widespread species, right? And I met a guy named Ryan Golombetsky, who is a Bigfoot paranormal researcher, television producer, and personality. Big personality. He's a great guy. And so he came on my podcast later in 2025 and talked about a theory he was developing. He just threw that out there, and he said, this is an open theory. So he welcomed anybody coming to do research on it. And it was basically had to do with a couple of the questions people ask about Bigfoot, based on some of the historic accounts in the ethnographies. One is, we don't find Bigfoot bodies, do we? We don't find their bones. Why is that? Where are they? Another is about longevity and Bigfoot health. A lot of anecdotal stories. The 8 Canyon incidents in Mount St. Helens in Washington State, where a miner claimed that he shot a Bigfoot and it fell down into a ravine, and yet he believed that it somehow was healed. And other people talking about seeing injured big feet, and that they seem to have miraculous healing powers. Why is that? And so the theory he talked about was this is based on perhaps a scientific parallel. So in 2023, a man named Dr. Joseph Detiri who has a PhD in hyperbaric medicine. And that is basically high pressure medicine in pressurized chambers, how medicine is affected by that. And so in 2023, he spent 100 days underwater, immersed underwater. He was actually in kind of an underwater lab that was about 100 square feet. And it was equalized air pressure inside versus water pressure. And they estimated it was about 1.7 atmospheres. So he was down there for 100 days. And eventually that time ended. He's in the Guinness Book of Records, at least right now. And when he surfaced, they did medical testing, blood testing, and so on. And one of the things they found, well, several things they found was he had a belief that his not calendar age, but biological age had regressed, that his body had grown younger by about a decade by being in this high pressure, high air pressure, enriched oxygen atmosphere, that the telomeres in his cells had gotten longer, that the number of stem cells floating through his body had increased. I throw this out about 10-20%. Again, getting younger. His REM sleep cycle had also increased, so he even felt better. And so that was his belief, was staying in a hyperbaric chamber for extended periods of time will lengthen your lifespan and aid in healing too. And all the time you can hear, it won't take a little bit of time to go online and find out about sports teams where you have football players that are put in decompression chambers or pressure chambers for healing purposes. And there are spas that offer hyperbaric treatments for that reason. So it was as Golembiewski's theory was, maybe Bigfoot goes deep into caves where the further up you go from ground level, air pressure decreases. So below ground level, air pressure must increase. And that in these chambers deep underground, the air pressure increases and they heal quicker. And I'll tell you what, I was ready to go buy a hyperbaric chamber and put it in my house. They have some really good ones for about $8,000 US. But I started looking into the theory because I was enthused about it. And I found there were some problems with this just adopting this 100%. And this is where I add onto that theory is if it's just a matter of air pressure, is probably not going to happen, or Bigfoot isn't going to do it, because one of the lowest points on the earth, natural place on earth, is the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is about, I'll throw it at about 2,000 feet below sea level. And yet the air pressure at the bottom of the Dead Sea is less than 1.1 atmospheres. There's a mine shaft in Canada. It's called the Kidd Mine. And the bottom of that mine shaft is 8,000 feet below sea level. And the atmospheric pressure there is only about 1.3 atmospheres. A far cry from the 1.7 that Dr. Deturi sat at. But I didn't want to stop there. So what other characteristics are there, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, in these underground chambers and caves? And it's unique gases or concentrations of gases. We are in a tectonically active and volcanic region in the Pacific Northwest, in the Cascade Mountains and on the Coast Range, where you have seismic events, earthquakes, where the earth comes together, the plates rub, creates heat, friction, gases are released. Same thing as gases are released deep in the earth by these volcanic actions. And so not only that, in some areas of cave networks, of which we have a lot here, you have these places where air pressure increases. Many, many very popular caves that spelunkers, cave divers go into, for safety's sake, they will have hatches and locks to keep unprepared people from going in and dying. And these are airlocks, so they actually have to undog the hatch, spin the wheel, and then they have to wait for pressure to equalize, because pressure oftentimes from various sources increases underground. So if you happen to have a very large chamber with air flowing through it from one place to another in the cave, and then all of a sudden there's a constriction in the cave network, that same volume of air is passing through, but is increasing in pressure. So there may well be certain very rare places where you have this combination of rare gases and rare gases under pressure. Continuing with that, I was looking at, well, are there examples, our ancestors? Think about in Europe, at least as far as we know, there are all these caves where people are living in the front of the cave because it's safe and because it's dry and they can kind of control the environment. But you go further back into some of these caves, far back, and there are chambers with all this artwork with paintings on it. And there's a thought that these were put there for religious purposes. People prehistorically purposely left artifacts like offerings deep in these caves. What if there are these unique circumstances that's not just deadly, like carbon monoxide gases, but beneficial gases? So I was looking through even our historic records, and I found some incidents of that. Many people have heard of the Oracle at Delphi, which is in Greece. Now, very, very briefly, the ancient accounts that go all the way back to about 800 BC, all the way to about 300 AD, they talk about the oracle there. And it's usually a woman, almost always a woman. And according to the stories, there was a temple of Apollo built at Delphi, and there was an inner chamber. And in that inner chamber, it's very, very small. There was a crack in the earth, and fumes used to come out of this crack in the earth. And the prophetess would sit on a tripod right at the center above this crack. And these sweet smelling fumes would come up, and she would breathe them in and begin speaking, and the god Apollo would speak through her. Her voice would change and her manner would change, and that was the prophecy. The oracle shut down, the place fell into ruins, and it was in the late 1900s, they started doing archaeological excavations there, and they dug into this Holy of Holies, and they didn't actually find cracks in the earth. What they found was initially they found a dirt floor, and then they excavated the dirt out, and they just found a paved rock floor, and it was dipped down somewhat, but it was certainly not cracks in the earth with fumes coming out of it. And so the archaeologist, being skeptical, said there's nothing to it. It's just a cute story. There must have been some other way that they were doing the prophecy. But other researchers starting in the early 2000s, and especially about 2016 to 2020, started looking at this again with a new light. And one of the things that they found was that the Temple of Apollo is located at the intersection of two different fault lines, and that there used to be major earthquakes in that area, and they since the last couple of hundred years, they've not happened so often. But what their theory was that deep in the earth, and they know this for a fact, that there's a layer of bitumen, which is kind of like a tarry, oily substance. And that their theory is that the fault line slippage, it would create pockets underground, and that this friction and heat acted on the bitumen, which freed up a gas called ethylene. And ethylene would then percolate out into the water system that was, these fault lines create a series of natural springs, and that the ethylene would percolate out into this water. And they found little water channels from these springs that went underneath the temple and through this area, this Holy of Holies, where the prophet's point would have been. And so their theory is that this water carrying ethylene was kept and channeled through there, and then it would evaporate, freeing up the ethylene. And that ethylene, these days, you know ethylene as the chemical spray that they put on various fruits and vegetables to get them to ripen up. It's a sweet-smelling gas. But from the early 1900s to about 1950, it was one of the most popular anesthetics used in Western medicine. because it had calming properties on people. They would, very light cases, they would be very, very calm. They could speak, but their voices altered. You give them a little bit more about it and they would pass out. And then they would wake up not remembering anything that happened. So it's their theory that that this ethylene concentration invoked this fugue state that turned into prophecy. So this is kind of a positive gas kind of a thing. And there are other instances of these various temples where it was poisonous gas, and people threw in sacrificial animals into these chambers where they suffocated, because in one case, this was a temple devoted to the god of the underworld, Hades. And so that was proof of that. So this is so intriguing to me. And some of these other gases, they're called rare gases or noble gases, are non-reactive. They don't catch fire. One of them, common in Earth's atmosphere, but also through these cave networks, is radon. And they have found that radon, under pressure in a hyperbaric chamber, not only acts as an anesthetic, but it also promotes healing and tissue recovery from various kinds of damage. And xenon, the gas xenon, which also comes out through these volcanic and earthquake eruptions in vents and tubes, also has tremendous therapeutic uses for people who've had oxygen starvation to the brain or to their internal organs. So there is, I think, something to this. What it is from here, I don't know, but that's why I talk about this openly in hopes other people get interested and they will do some of their own research and we'll bring more to this. But I got to warn you, don't go into caves if you don't have the experience or the training. Every year, as many as I've heard an estimate of 50 people a year are seriously injured or killed in the United States alone in caves. So be really, really safe, be scientific, and be open with your findings.